Okay then, so let's turn to the book of Hosea. And Hosea is the first of the 12 minor prophets. So we're on the last stretch, if you like, of looking at the books of the Old Testament. 12 minor prophets closes the Old Testament. And I'm sure you know that the term minor simply refers to the size of the books, I guess, rather than the importance or the significance of the prophets themselves. Some prophets have very short books, others have longer books, and they group together simply because of that fact. So there's 12, and Hosea is the first, and he had a long ministry, about 60 years or so, we think. And he was the only prophet of his time, I guess, for the nation of Israel. So this is the northern nation, the kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes. He was their prophet. So if we take a look at the structure of the book, and we'll see, first of all, that you have an introduction. So you can call that the first section if you wish. Hosea chapter 1, verse 1, the word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, and Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. So there's your context. And then the next section of the book extends from verse 2 of chapter 1 down to the end of chapter 3. And what you have here is the family history. It's Hosea marrying his wife Gomer and the children that they have. So let's just take a look at that then. So this is the second section of the book of Hosea. And in chapter 1, verse 2, the Lord speaks to Hosea and says to him, "Go, take yourself a wife of harlotry." And these are great words, aren't they? He's commanded by God to marry a prostitute. And her name, as you can see there, is Gomer in verse 3. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. So the first son is born, and his name is Jezreel. That's verse 4. We'll talk about that in a moment. Verse 6. She conceives again, and she has a daughter this time, and her name is Ruhamah. And then finally, there's child number 3, verse 8, and the name of the son born here is Lo-Ami. So 3 children in quick succession. And we'll talk about that when we come to look at the context. This is the structure. So what then happens in chapter 2 is Gomer leaves Hosea and the children, and she returns to her previous profession, if you like. And chapter 2 is a theological reflection on what has happened between Hosea and Gomer. And then in chapter 3, we have a reuniting of Hosea and Gomer in their marriage. So chapter 3, then the Lord said to me, "Go again, love a woman who is loved by a lover and is committing adultery, just like the Lord for the children of Israel." We'll talk about that in a moment. So verse 2, I bought it for myself for 15 shekels of silver, 1 1/2 homers of barley. And I say to you, you shall stay with me. So there's a reunion there between the two. That's the second section of the book, the family history of Hosea. You then get the next section of the book, which is from chapter 4 through to chapter 13. And it's a series of oracles delivered against the nation of Israel. So don't forget now, Hosea is the prophet to the nation of Israel, and it's very familiar territory. We're having the woes being pronounced against Israel through the ministry of Hosea. And the historical context is the rise of Assyria as the great world power, and Assyria seeking to expand and dominate the nations in the Middle East there. And of course, Assyria will ultimately defeat Israel and bring the kingdom of Israel to an end. So what you have then in this section are these oracles, the judgments of God because of Israel's sin. And it's a series of quite challenging and difficult oracles, but it's interspersed with two moments of sunshine. And all I want you to notice are those moments, and then we'll discuss them later on. So the first moment of sunshine occurs in chapter 6, verses 1 through to 3. Come and let us return to the Lord. For he is torn, but he will heal us. He is stricken, but he will bind us up. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will raise us up, that we may live in his sight. Let us pursue the knowledge of the Lord. So there's the first ray of sunshine against this backdrop of judgment. And then the second is found in chapter 11, Hosea 11, and especially in the first verse. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. And then verse 3, I taught Ephraim or Israel to walk, taking them by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. So even though there's an optimistic and hopeful start, and it's the imagery of a father seeking to teach his child to walk and nurturing his child, it's still peppered with references to the sin of Israel. And the imagery there was taken up later by Ezekiel. And we saw when we looked at Ezekiel how he had that vision of an abandoned baby found in a field, covered in birth blood and still with the umbilical cord, and God passes by and he sees the child and he adopts the child. So Ezekiel builds on this imagery that you find in chapter 11. So that's the bulk of the book of Hosea, a series of oracles against Israel. And then you have the final chapter of the book, which is the conclusion, the final section, and it's an appeal. It's an appeal then in the light of all these warnings of judgment and punishment for sin. It's an invitation to Israel to return to the Lord. And chapter 14 is famous as a chapter of hope and restoration and the grace of God in receiving the one who returns to him. So let's read Hosea and chapter 14. O Israel, return to the Lord your God, for you have stumbled because of your iniquity. Take words with you and return to the Lord and say to him, take away all iniquity, receive us graciously, for we shall offer the sacrifice of our lips. And then a reference to Assyria, the country that will form the empire and defeat Israel. Assyria shall not save us. We will not ride on horses, nor will we say any more to the work of our hands, you are our gods, for in you the fatherless find mercy. And this is the response of God then. I will heal their backsliding. I will love them freely. For my anger has turned away from him. I will be like the dew to Israel, and he shall grow like the lily, and lengthen his roots like Lebanon. His branches shall spread, his beauty shall be like an olive tree, and his fragrance like Lebanon. Those who dwell under his shadow shall return. They shall be revived like grain and grow like a vine. Their scent shall be like the wine of Lebanon. Ephraim shall say, what have I to do any more with idols? I have heard and observed him. I am like a green cypress tree. Your fruit is found in me. Who is wise? Let him understand these things. Who is prudent? Let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right. The righteous walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them. So it's a very gracious invitation from God, promising to receive the one who returns from his backslidings. A couple of things to note. If you look at verse 8, where it says, I am like a green cypress tree. and your fruit is found in me. It has a very, very unusual image there to represent God. God is comparing himself to a tree, and he's offering his fruit to Israel for them to come and take shade under the tree and to eat the fruit and to be blessed. And that imagery is one in which God is saying to us that all that he is available to us. That if you like, God, like a tree, passively gives up his fruit for the benefit of his people. A very, very unusual imagery, and I can remember a famous sermon being preached about that and reading the sermon many years after it was preached. And then verse 8 has references to the wise and to the prudent. And so there's a hint here of wisdom, wisdom literature. It's the same divisions of wise and prudent that you see with Paul in 1 Corinthians. And it has links to the book of Isaiah. So that's the structure, if you like, of Hosea. So the majority of the book is judgment, but then it's got these elements of hope. So let's think of the themes, and I'm sure all of you are very well aware that the major theme is the relationship between God and Israel as we first encounter it through Hosea and Gomer. So Hosea, like Ezekiel and like Jeremiah, who will come after him, Hosea is expected to embody what he is teaching. He is a lived example of his ministry. So if we think of Jeremiah and especially Ezekiel, who through their actions, through their clothing, through their lifestyle, they gave representation to the truths that they were bringing to the people. Hosea is an early example of that. Through his marriage to Gomer, he becomes a symbol of the relationship between Israel and their God. So God, as a husband, loves his wife Israel, and Hosea, as a husband, loves Gomer. Gomer's background isn't great, and so we see the background of Israel depicted there. And then even though Hosea loves Gomer and they have children together, she returns to her first loves. And that's a picture of Israel who returns to her first loves, which are the other gods, the idols, the Baals, the constructions of their own hands, the shrines that were scattered throughout Israel. She returns, Israel returns. And so you have a counterplay between Hosea and Gomer and Israel and God. That's what you have as the major theme of the book. And then that theme is then worked out through the children that Hosea and Gomer have, and the names that the children are given. Now, again, you have a point of contact with Isaiah and his marriage and the names of his children. So there's a fair amount of similarity going on between the two. So let's take a look at the names of the children, and I'm sure you're familiar with this yourselves. The first name then, Jezreel, and this is the place linked to King Ahab and to his wife Jezebel. It's where Ahab had his palace. It's next door to Naboth and his vineyard. And it's the place where, following Elijah's Mount Carmel victory, do you remember, in 1 Kings, wherever it is, chapter 18? Do you remember the cloud like a man's hand comes and the drought ends, and Elijah runs down the hill and he's kind of full of excitement, and then Jezebel sends the news that she will kill him. It's Jezreel that they were heading for, that Elijah was heading for. And so it's Jezreel then, where Jezebel meets her end. Do you remember? She is thrown from a window, an upper story window, and she then falls to the ground and her body smashes against the floor and the dogs lick her blood, just as was prophesied. So that's Jezreel. And Jezreel is also well known as the place where Jehu the king slaughtered all the 70 sons of Ahab. So the background to Jezreel then, it's Elijah, it's Jezebel, Ahab, Jehu the king. And you can look this up in 1 Kings 18, 1 Kings 21, 2 Kings 9, and 2 Kings 10. So what's going on here then? In Hosea and Gomer naming their firstborn, their son Jezreel, well, the idea is that the birth of this son indicates the end of the dynasty that is currently in control of Israel. So the first verse, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. It's where that is going to end. So if you take a look at some of the verses then, 1 verse 4, I will avenge the bloodshed of Jezreel on the house of Jehu and bring an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. It shall come to pass in that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. So this place where Jehu killed the sons of Ahab will be the place where the Assyrians will come and defeat Israel in the future. And you have another reference to this in chapter 2 of Hosea and verses 21 and 22. Just take a look at them. So Hosea 2:21, it shall come to pass in that day that I will answer, says the Lord, I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth. The earth shall answer with grain, with new wine, and with oil. They shall answer Jezreel. Then I will sow her for myself in the earth, and I will have mercy on her who had not obtained mercy. So it's about judgment on the ruling house of Israel, judgment for their past sins in killing those 70 sons, but there's also a touch of hope there, just at the end of verse 22 in chapter 2, and we'll talk more about that later on. Okay, so that's Jezreel. Then you've got the other two children, the daughter, Lo Ruhamah, and the son, Lo Ami. And what we have here is a play on the names, No Mercy, Not My People. And what we are discovering then is that initially these two children become symbols of God's rejection of Israel. They are no longer going to be his child, Israel, and he will no longer have mercy on them. That's how it starts off. But then, as the prophecy continues, God promises that where he was once not going to have mercy, he now will. And those who were once not his people will be his people. So there's a reversal. So the initial idea with the two children is rejection, and then through them is introduced the idea of God once again having mercy and having a people. So you can see, can't you, for yourself as we go along. Chapter 1, verse 10. Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there it shall be said to them, you are sons of the living God. Then the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together and appoint for themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land. And great will be the day of Jezreel. So there's the hope of it turning around. Say to your brethren, my people, and to your sisters, mercy is shown. So here's hope being brought in. God will turn the situation around. And of course, the question becomes, when does this happen? At what point? Does God go to the people whom he had rejected, go to the people whom he had said no mercy, and then reverse that? And they become one, and they have a new head. Now, when does that happen? Because Israel gets wiped out, and Judah, years later, will be taken into captivity. When does this happen? Okay, so when is the time frame, or how are these promises fulfilled that you meet with in Hosea? So there's the children and their names. Can I show you another name? If you look at chapter 2, and you have a reference there to the valley of Acre. So let's take a look. And we're in chapter 2 of Hosea, and we're looking at verse 15. Verse 15 of Hosea 2. I will give her her vineyards from there, and the valley of Acre as a door of hope. She shall sing there, as in the days of her youth, as in the day when she came up from the land of Egypt. So there's a reference there to the valley of Acre. And I'm sure you know the background. What's this all about? Well, this is a reference to the days of Joshua, when they were entering into the land of Canaan. They'd had the great victory at Jericho, and then that was followed, you remember, by a defeat at a little town called Ai. And that defeat was attributed to Achan, and Achan and his sin. Now, we discussed this when we looked at the book of Joshua. Do you remember Achan had stolen some of the idols, and he buried them in his tent in the ground, and he'd hidden them. And there was this idea of sin in the camp, and so they lost their battle, a small, insignificant battle, so it seemed. So the valley of Acre then is in Joshua chapter 7. Let's take a look. So let's turn to Joshua and chapter 7, and we need to find verse 24. So Joshua's discovered now what Achan has done. He's discovered why they lost the battle. He's discovered the secret sin. And we read then in chapter 7, verse 24. Then Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan, the son of Zerah, the silver, the garments, the wedge of gold, his sons, his daughters, his oxen, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, and all that he had. And they brought them to the valley of Acre. And then if you go down to verse 26, stay in verse 25. Joshua said, why have you troubled us? The Lord will trouble you this day. So verse 25, all Israel stoned him with stones, and they burned them with fire after they had stoned them with stones. Then they raised over him a great heap of stones, still there to this day. So the Lord turned from the fierceness of his anger. Therefore the name of that place has been called to the valley of Achor, or trouble, to this day. Now, Hosea, making reference to that, says God will turn the valley of Acre into a valley of hope. It'll be a door, an opportunity for hope. And this is one of the great themes that you can take from Hosea. It's the theme of how the very place, the very occasion for our defeats and our discouragements, the very place where we lose, and the very place where we sin can become a door of hope in the grace and the mercy and the goodness of God. God doesn't bring in hope elsewhere. He meets us in the place of defeat and turns the place of defeat into an opportunity for hope. And there's another link here to Isaiah 65 and verse 10, because Isaiah will tell you the same thing. So it's another interesting point of contact between Hosea and Isaiah. And it's a wonderful picture of grace and mercy and hope that you have here in an otherwise quite challenging prophecy of unfaithfulness and judgment. Okay, then, so we've seen Hosea, his family, how his family become a living embodiment of the relationship between God and Israel, and the significance of names, the idea of reversal, turning bad into good, according to the hopes and the purposes of God. Let's do one or two more themes. And a major theme in the book of Hosea is the idea of reaping what you've sown. Now, this isn't unique to Hosea, but it's certainly an element of his prophecy. So let me show you a couple of verses then. Hosea 2:22, the earth shall answer with grain and with new wine and with oil, And then they shall answer Jezreel, verse 23, then I will sow her for myself in the earth. I will have mercy on her who had not obtained mercy. Then I will say to those who were not my people, you are my people. The idea then in verse 23 of sowing. And if you like, it's a new beginning. So they've reaped the judgment of God. They've reaped the fact that they are not a people anymore, that they're not going to have mercy. But God will now, in that very place, sow his mercy again, and he'll sow his people again, and they will be future, and they will be hope. Sowing and reaping. If you turn across to chapter 8 and verse 7, you have the same idea. Hosea 8 and verse 7, they sow the wind and they reap the whirlwind. And in chapter 10 and verse 12, you have the same idea. Sow for yourselves righteousness, reap in mercy. Now, the Apostle Paul liked the idea of reaping and sowing, and he would use it on many occasions in different epistles. He would say that if you sow to the flesh, you will reap destruction. He would talk about if you sow to the spirit, then you will reap life. So he likes the idea of sowing and reaping. So just as reference, we don't need to look them up. You can turn to Galatians 6, verses 6 to 10. And you've got Paul giving us a great deal of what he has reflected on about the nature between what you sow is what you reap. And then in 2 Corinthians 9, he does something very similar. So Paul seems to build on what Hosea tells us here about this principle that is at work in the kingdom of God. Okay? We then have the idea of the messianic themes. So do you remember I told you, between chapter 4 and chapter 13, you've got all these oracles of judgment and woe and doom, broken by two rays of sunshine. And those two rays of sunshine are messianic in nature. They point towards the Lord Jesus Christ. And I'm sure you've seen it already. Chapter 6 of Hosea and verse 2. After 2 days, he will revive us, and on the third day, he will raise us up. And that's the Hebrew word for resurrection. And so you've got a very rare moment in the Old Testament where the word resurrection is used in the scriptures. You've got the idea of resurrection. You have the idea of resurrection with Abraham and Isaac. You have the idea of resurrection with Elisha, but here you have the actual word being used, the word resurrection. And that, of course, is pointing us towards Christ, and these words are used there in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. So there's the first messianic moment. And then the second, do you remember, chapter 11 and the first verse? When Israel was a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt, I called my son. And that verse gets quoted by Matthew in his discussion or in the birth narratives of the return of Jesus and Joseph and Mary from Egypt into Israel and ultimately into Nazareth. And this is part of that overarching idea that you have in the Bible, right from Abraham and into Moses, and then up through the Old Testament into the Gospel of the place of Egypt, the place you go down into. So Abraham went down, and Joseph went down, and Moses was there. This is the idea of the place that you come up from. God calls you from, and God calls you from Egypt as a son. So this is part of that great theme that stretches right across the Bible. So those are the messianic moments. Now, what I'd like us to do is this. I want us to talk about something you find in Hosea chapter 10. So let's turn there, and I want us to look at verse 8 and see what we make of it, okay? So, Hosea 10 and verse 8. Also the high places of Avon, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. The thorn and the thistle shall grow on their altars. They shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. Now, the reason why I want us to take notice of this verse is, first of all, because of Avon, the place. It's also known as Beth Avon, but it's known by a much more familiar name than Beth Avon or Avon. We know it well, but Hosea is using a different name, a substitute name, in order to refer to the place. So where is that then? But then these, one more thing, thorns and thistles shall grow on the altar. Thorns and thistles were, in Genesis 3, amongst the first examples of the judgment of God following the sin of Adam and Eve. So thorns and thistles, and it occurs in chapter 8, I think, or chapter 9 of Hosea as well. Thorns and thistles become symbolic of the judgment of God. But this is what I think is really interesting. They shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. Now, Jesus takes up this phrase in his teaching. If you turn to Luke and chapter 23 and verse 30, I think. Let's take a look. So, Luke 23 and verse 30. So Jesus is being led away now from his trial and the judgment of crucifixion, and he's been led away to the place of his execution. And as he is on the journey, he meets the women, the crowd, mourning and lamenting him. And he addresses them. Verse 28. Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed, the days are coming in which they will say, blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, and breasts which never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things in the greenwood, what will be done in the dry? Now, why does Jesus quote Hosea as he journeys to the cross? Okay, so keep that in mind. And then I want you to turn to Revelation and chapter 6 and then chapter 9. So Revelation, let's find it, chapter 6. I'm not there yet, so bear with me. Revelation 6 and verse 16, I think. I hope I got that right now. Revelation 6, verse 16. And say to their neighbors, and they will say to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. So fall on us and cover us. Okay. And then in chapter 9 and verse 6, there's a link again. In those days, men will seek death and will not find it. They will desire to die, and death will flee from them. So calling to the hills and the mountains, cover us and hide us, is the idea that death is preferable to life. It's the seeking of death. Now, let's discuss this. Why does Jesus make a reference to it? And why is it in the book of Revelation? One thing I've forgotten to do, and that's just to talk a bit about the name Hosea. Salvation is of the Lord. But if you turn to Numbers and chapter 13, where are we? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and chapter 13 and verse 8. So Numbers 13, verse 8, look at what we find. So we have a list of the spies sent into Canaan. And in Numbers 13, verse 8, from the tribes of Ephraim, Hosea, the son of Nun. So who's Hosea then? Verse 17, Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, said to them, go up this way into the south and go up into the mountains. Hosea is one of the 12 spies. But if you go back a verse to verse 16, these are the names of the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land. And Moses called Hosea, the son of Nun, Joshua. So Hosea has his name changed to Joshua, and he becomes the leader who takes them into the land of Canaan. Why does Moses do that, do you think? So 3 things to talk about. The use that Jesus makes of this verse from chapter 10, how Revelation builds on what we find in Hosea, and why does Moses rename Hosea to Joshua right here in the book of Numbers.